Shelian asked. One of the four supremes, ship sinking, black water? 4 calamities, not 4 supremes, came the response. Shelian then remembered that he had forgotten about Chirong and apologized. Ah, sorry, my mistake, he said. There's no way that night touring Green Lantern could be on the same level as the other 3. As someone who had crammed the scrolls, Shelian roughly knew a bit about the ship sinking Blackwater. According to the legends, this was a powerful water ghoul who lurked in the outer seas. Just like the Crimson Rain sword flower, he slaughtered his way out of Mount Tonglu. Although he tended to keep a low profile, that could only be said for the mortal and heavenly realms. Roughly counting, he had swallowed at least 500 ghosts across the land, and amongst them around 400 were high-level water ghouls. The black water demon Lair was his resting domain. Ghost City was under Hua Cheng's jurisdiction. When one stepped foot into his domain, his word was law. Once within the boundaries, the world is lawless. It was just so here as well. There was a saying that was even more widespread in the underworld. Crimson rules the land, black masters the waters. Crimson obviously referred to Hua Cheng. Therefore, black was none other than Blackwater Demon Xuan. Hui Ming spoke. Water Master Xiong, you're really unlucky this time. Demon Xuan isn't anything like the green ghost, even though he's not the type to cause trouble. Luckily, we haven't strayed too far. We should steer back before we're discovered. The others stared at him. Well, why don't you change course then? They asked. Aren't you the one in charge of this ship? Hui Ming was equally surprised. It didn't already change course, he said. This ship should do it automatically. It shouldn't require manual labor. Yet the rudder didn't budge at all. With no other option, Hui Ming resorted to steering it himself. When his hand landed on the rudder, he furrowed his brows. Shelian went up to help. It won't move? He asked. It was impossible that Hui Ming lacked the strength. Shelian, who was fairly confident in his own strength, wasn't able to move it either. After examining the situation at hand, Ming Yi announced, It might have been caught by something. I'll go down to take a look. Shiqing Shan chimed in. I'll go with you, Ming Xiong. But Shawudu said sternly, Come back here. Don't go running around. His brother was still in the middle of passing his trial and shouldn't be distracted or emotionally agitated. Shiqing Shan wouldn't dare risk it and obediently came back, leaving Ming Yi to investigate under the deck by himself. Shelian wanted to help too, but he knew that when it came to building and repairs, he wasn't as capable as the Earth Master. Even if he went, he wouldn't be able to help much anyway. As he was gazing into the pitch-black sea that surrounded them, Shelian suddenly remembered something. He asked, Are there any fishermen that ended up in this part of the sea? Hua Cheng, who had partnered up with Shelian in the search and rescue, was the first one to discover the stranded fishermen. He did a quick survey around and said, It's unlikely. Blackwater Demon Lair is in the South Sea. They wouldn't drift this far. Besides, the area here has a barrier. Not just anyone can enter this place. Even if they did, there wouldn't be any hope for a rescue. There's nothing that wouldn't sink once it's drifted here. The South Sea. They hadn't realized that they'd drifted this far. Shelian tested his spiritual communication array, and the connection was indeed down. Even though the connection before was spotty, it was still usable, but now it was just complete dead silence. Although the sea looked peaceful, who knew what sort of danger lurked beneath, waiting for the chance to ambush them? The sky was turning darker, and Tian felt uneasy. Since there's no stranded fishermen in these parts, if Lord Earthmaster is not able to repair the ship, we might as well abandon the ship and seek land first. When Lord Watermaster returns to the East Sea for his trial, we can continue the search and rescue there as well, he suggested. Might as well, Pei Ming agreed as he opened the cabin door. Who knew that, after the door was pulled open, he would be met with the interior of an empty cabin instead of the scenery of land? His expression changed immediately. The distance shortening array lost its power, he said. Hua Cheng laughed and replied, "Isn't that normal? If you can't even use the spiritual communication array, how would the distance shortening array be any better?" Pei Ming looked over and asked, "This little buddy here seems quite calm for a youngster, and doesn't seem worried at all." Tian interrupted. "The ship has already drifted into ghost territory, and it's sinking as we speak. We can't leave even if we wanted to. Let's solve the problem at hand first." Shi Qingshuan called out to the person under the deck, "Ming Xiang, how's the situation looking down there? Can you fix it?" Ming Yi's voice came from beneath. "Nothing's broken. The ship isn't caught in anything either. It's something else that caused the ship to lose its power." "This is Demon Xuan's playground now," Pei Ming said. As he was speaking, the ship dipped again. With a glance, Tian saw that the water had already swallowed half of the ship. If it was a normal boat, it would have given way by now. However, since the ship was crafted by gods, it was still resisting sinking and fighting to stay afloat. "There must be exceptions. It's impossible that everything would sink here," he insisted. "There must be something that wouldn't sink." "There is," Hua Cheng said. The attention instantly fell on him. With his arms folded, he lazily said, "There's one type of wood that's able to float across the black water demon lair without sinking." Tian guessed a few common, special types of wood. Sandalwood, agar wood, elm. "Coffinwood," Hua Cheng answered. "Coffinwood?" Tian asked. Hua Cheng said. "There's no one who has returned alive after they stumbled into the black water demon lair except for one person. That person was traveling home with his deceased loved one's corpse. When the boat sank, he drifted back to land on top of the coffin." Pei Ming raised his brow. "This little buddy sure knows a lot," he said. Hua Cheng mirrored his expression and replied, "It's not much. You just know too little, that's all." Even though Shavuda didn't move from his seated meditation pose, he turned his attention to Hua Cheng and narrowed his eyes. He said, "Pei Xiang, I had wanted to ask earlier, just who is this?" Pei Ming explained, "I'm afraid you'd have to ask His Highness for that. After all, it's someone from his palace." Shi Qingshuan interrupted them. All right. It doesn't matter how much or how little he knows. Now that the spells have lost their power, where does one go to get a coffin around here?" "No need, it's simple," Pei Ming answered. "Gurga and I will build one for you right now and show you what it means to take things into your own hands and be rich in food and dress." "It won't work," Hua Cheng pointed out. "It has to be a coffin that has carried a corpse." They couldn't possibly build a coffin, then offer a person in the group and toss them in there. In the midst of their conversation, the boat dipped again. The slightly tilted deck that they were standing on was almost at the same level as the water surface. Shavudu, who was sitting dignified in his meditation pose, almost tripped over. "I give up. Let me handle this," he said coldly. He took out his fan and tapped it lightly against his forehead before fanning it out, revealing the water character on the front and a wave pictogram made up of 3 curving lines on the back. He lifted his arm and called out, "Water, come forth." Instantly, Tian felt the ship being lifted up. The deck under him rose several inches above water, bringing back a sense of safety. "The Watermaster fan can even control the water in the black water demon lair?" he asked in surprise. "Not the water here," Hua Cheng corrected. "He channeled the water from the outside." It seemed that they had just crossed the boundary into the black water demon lair and hadn't ventured too far into it. Shawudu was able to draw water from the seas nearby to lift the ship up from underneath. Pei Ming praised. "Beautifully done, Watermaster Xiong. Now that the rudder is useless, the boat can't turn back. You should hurry and use the water to pull the ship back." Before Shawudu could reply, the ship dipped once again. The demon lair water refused to back down and clashed with the current from the outer seas. This time, the dip was stronger, causing the deck to tilt even more. Losing balance, the crew slid to the port side of the ship. Although Shawudu was born with a delicate and handsome face, his personality was extremely stubborn, refusing to back down. When he felt that something was going against him, a flash of anger appeared on his face. He snapped his fan shut and opened it again. The 3 wave lines grew bigger. The current in the ocean doubled in force, and the ship was yanked up once again. With one force commanding the boat to sink and another forcing it to rise, the back and forth made it seem like a giant tug-of-war game. The erratic movements of the ship, along with the constant lifts and drops, caused the seawater around them to splash wildly and gush in and out. If it was anyone else on the ship, they'd be scared witless by now. Tian grasped the ledge with one hand and tightly held on to Hua Cheng with the other. "What's happening? The ship is turning," he said in bewilderment. True to his words, the ship had already started spinning toward a certain direction. The faster it spun, the lower it sank. It was then that Tian realized that the ship had fallen into a giant whirlpool and was being slowly sucked into the eye. "Everyone be careful," he warned. "The 2 forces of water are battling." It was obvious that Shawudu wasn't on his home turf. The water that he summoned from the outer seas was powerful, but once it crossed the border, the strength was suppressed significantly. To go against the demon lair current, it was at a great disadvantage. As expected, as soon as the words left Tian's mouth, the giant ship fell into the eye of the whirlpool. In that last second, Tian tossed out Feng Xin. He pulled in Hua Cheng, and the 2 stepped onto the sword and flew up. At first, he was worried that Feng Xin wouldn't have the strength to fly. But the moment they left the deck, he let out a sigh of relief. Although shaky, it was still able to fly. Looking down from above, the entire area was painted in a terrifying black. It was easy to see the collision between the 2 different colored currents. Their fierce battle was what formed this enormous whirlpool. As the eye swallowed the ship whole, the 2 currents of water separated. However, the battle was far from over. Like 2 venomous vipers, they continued to snap at each other. Each collision was followed by a mountain of angry waves. Tian looked around and called, "Lord Windmaster, Lord Earthmaster, General Pei." Shi Qingshuan's voice came from 10 feet behind him. "Your Highness, we're here." "Did you also jump on your imperial sword?" Tian turned around, and the scene that unfolded before him rendered him speechless. Mingyi was standing on top of the handle of a shovel, while Shi Qingshuan was sitting on the head of said shovel, waving at him. This wasn't an imperial sword. It was an imperial shovel. This sort of imagery was undoubtedly hard on the eyes. On the other side, Pei Ming's voice sounded. "What about Watermaster Xiong?" Seeing that Pei Ming was on his sword alone, and there was no sign of the Watermaster, Shi Qingshuan also called out, "Ge, Go! Shilian reassured. No need to panic. He's the water master. It'll be hard for him to sing. But when he recalled the power of that whirlpool, he turned to Hua Cheng. Sanlang, hold on tight to my waist. Don't fall. Hua Cheng put on an obedient act and replied, Okay, but Gogo, there's something that I have to tell you. What is it? Shilian asked. Hua Cheng replied, You can't fly in the black water demon lair. It'll attract things. Not a second later, a sharp cry pierced through the air. A giant white creature broke through the water surface, heading straight for Pei Ming. Pei Ming was a master swordsman. The moment when he sensed killing intent, his hand reached for his sword, only to realize that said sword was under his feet. Luckily, his reaction was quick. With a leap, he grabbed his sword in midair and sliced the incoming creature in half. Before gravity could take control, he flipped back onto the sword with not a single hair out of place. As if it was nothing, he steadily flew up and asked in total calmness, What was that thing? The sliced corpse of the creature was slightly visible from the water surface. Shilian squinted his eyes to get a better look. Fish, he guessed. It was definitely a fish, but not an average fish. It was a fish bone that was as wide as a fish tank and many feet in length. This fish had neither flesh nor scales, but only stark white bones that connected to a sharp, teeth-filled mouth. Whether it was poisonous or not, if bitten, it would surely be painful as hell. Pei Ming flew higher and warned, You all be careful, there's probably more than one of them. As expected, when he mentioned one, a second one shot out from below. This time, it headed straight for Ming Yi and Shi Qingxuan. Unfortunately, the Earthmaster wasn't a martial god, and his fighting power wasn't as strong. The Windmaster was now just a god in a mortal's body. On top of all of this, Ming Yi was rather rusty with his imperial shovel. Even though the two didn't get bitten, they were still knocked off balance and into the sea. As they were falling in mid-air, Shi Qingxuan cried out in despair, Ming Shang, I hope you remember to practice using your treasure more often after today. Ming Yi retorted, Get lost. Pei Ming sighed and rushed over to rescue the two. Seeing that Pei Ming went forward to lend a hand, Shilian knew that he would be able to handle it alone. It's really not Lord Earthmaster's fault, he thought to himself. With a shovel like that as a treasured weapon, no one with any shame would dare to take it out. Just then, a bone-chilling breeze went through him. Shilian gathered his thoughts and said softly, Sanlang, hang on tight. Watch out, there's something coming our way. Okay, Hua Cheng responded. The hands wrapped around his waist tightened. Not long after, 4 water walls shot up from below and surrounded them. 4 giant bonefish rose from the sea. The 4 gigantic bone-white corpses were more like dragons than fish. The combination of hills of dorsal fin bones, dangerously sharp horns, long snake-like bodies, and protruding 4 claws circled around Shilian and Hua Cheng, leaving no room for escape. As for flying upward, this was as high as Feng Xin could go. If they were to go down, they'd come face to face with the dead silent ocean. Shilian sighed in defeat. All right, he said. Who's first? After a moment of consideration, he clasped his hands together. Together it is, he said. Soon after, the bone dragon on the east side let out a howl and rushed forward. Shilian raised his right hand and pointed in its direction. Instantly, the bone dragon froze. For such an enormous monster to be detained by 1 sword, 1 person, and 1 finger, and not being able to even fly an inch forward, it angrily thrashed around its tail and claws, creating walls of waves. The other 3 lunged forward as well, Shilin turned his pointing finger into a claw. He grabbed the bone dragon's horn and whipped it in a circle as if it was a weapon. A loud whoosh tore through the sky. The 3 incoming dragons were instantly skewered by the one Shilin threw out, before dropping down to the ocean as scattered pieces of bone. Shilin dusted off his hands and let out a breath. He turned around and asked, "Sanlang, are you okay?" With crescent eyes, Hua Cheng smiled and said, "Under Gurga's protection, how can anything happen to me?" Hearing him respond like that made Shilin feel rather awkward and embarrassed. Now that he thought about it, dealing with these sorts of things was an easy task for Hua Cheng. How could there be any problems? It made Shilin's question seem as if he was intentionally asking for praise. Though, in all honesty, he asked for the sake of asking. Lost in his thoughts, the sword suddenly sank, and before Shilin could even register what had happened, they were already falling rapidly, plunging into the icy cold water. It wasn't because they were grabbed by something. It was simply due to the fact that Feng Xin was too old. After holding on for so long, it needed to rest. The bone-chilling seawater gushed in from all directions. After accidentally swallowing 2 gulps of water, Shilin closed his mouth and swam upward. However, the black water demon Lair water was as wicked as they described. Shilin considered himself to be a fairly good swimmer, yet in these waters his body felt like an iron block. No matter what he did, it refused to float. He opened his eyes, but the water was just as muddy, and he wasn't able to locate Hua Cheng anywhere. He felt around with his hands. Other than Feng Xin, he wasn't able to grab hold of anything else, and he could start to feel the panic rise from inside him. However, the more anxious he was, the more sluggish his movements were, and the faster he sank. Luckily, not long after, it was as if someone had parted the fog. Shilin felt a ray of light shining down on him. He felt someone grab his hand and waist and quickly lift him to the surface. Once out of the water, Shilin gasped for breath, and when he wiped the water away from his face, he saw that his savior was none other than Hua Cheng. It was quite strange, as according to the common saying, the dead sink, Hua Cheng, who was technically a corpse, should have sunk faster than Shilin. Yet he was floating lightly and effortlessly on the water surface. He bent his head down and looked at Shilin. "Are you all right?" he asked. Shilin nodded. The familiarity of the scene suddenly brought memories of a similar situation that had happened not so long ago. Instantly, he felt his face heat up. With one hand wrapped around Shilin, Hua Cheng used his bare hand to stir and leisurely glide through the water. "Gurga, hold on to me," he said. "You'll sink if you let go." At a loss for words, Shilin blankly nodded several times. Not far from them was a stir of movements in the water, and a row of horn-like bones rose to the surface. Like a school of sharks, it swam toward them with incredible speed. The 4 bone dragons that were badly beaten by Shilin were back for revenge. They circled the 2 with the starving gazes of predators, and finally, after they couldn't hold themselves back any longer, they viciously dove in. Grasping Feng Xin tightly in his hand, Shilin waited for the moment to strike. Above him, Hua Cheng clicked his tongue in annoyance. The bone dragons were almost within an arm's reach from tearing them apart, but upon hearing the sound, their killing intent instantly vanished. The teeth-filled mouth that was about to snap Shilin's throat instead came forth and nudged at Feng Xin as if giving it a few pecks. Shilin was confused. While he was still floating there dumbfoundedly, the 4 creatures scampered away with their tails between their legs. Shilin was speechless, but Hua Cheng had already continued swimming. He said, "Gurga, now you know. If you're going to get any pets in future, definitely don't consider those ones. their useless trash. Hits? Shilian replied meekly, "No, I wasn't considering anything." Suddenly, a bone dragon broke through the water surface and shot up straight into the sky. Shilian looked up and saw that Shawudu sat atop the creature's head, his hands clasped together to form an aggressive attack hand seal. His face was tense, as if he was vigorously fighting against some force. The once peaceful and calm ocean was now tossing and turning. Not seeing any sign of the Wind God or the others, Shilian called out, "Lord Windmaster, Lord Earthmaster, General Pei, where are you?" He scanned his surroundings under the dim moonlight. Instead of finding his comrades, he found himself being swallowed up by a huge shadow. He spun around and his eyes widened at the sight of an enormous wave that was as tall as the sky falling his way. In the next second, he fell into complete darkness. After being carried by the ebb and flow of the ocean for a long time, Shilian finally opened his eyes. Although he didn't sit up, he could feel from beneath him that he arrived on land. As he lay there, regaining his strength, he lifted up an arm and saw that his hand had become pruny from the prolonged soak in the water. He felt something under his waist. When he tilted his head to take a look, he realized that the object was Hua Cheng's arm. Judging from the position of the figure lying next to him, it seemed that Hua Cheng had never once let go of him. Though he had already woken up, Hua Cheng had not. His eyes were still shut. Shilian sat up and gently nudged him. "San Lang," he said. "San Lang." Hua Cheng didn't respond. Shilian nudged him again while scanning their surroundings. They were on land, but aside from the vast amount of trees that crowded together to form an endless forest, there were no signs of docks or people at all. Rather than mainland, it was more of an isolated island. Above all, the most surprising thing was that it was already daylight. They must have floated for an entire night. Where could they have ended up? After repeated poking, Hua Cheng was still deep asleep and hadn't moved an inch. Ghosts couldn't drown. At least that's what Shilian thought. However, just because Hua Cheng couldn't drown, it didn't mean that other things in the ocean, such as the poisonous bonefish, couldn't have attacked him. Thus, Shilian patted Hua Cheng down, starting from his chest to his arms and all the way to his legs, to make sure that there weren't any wounds. Yet, other than discovering that Hua Cheng had a fine body, there were no other finds. Shilian was at his wit's end and started to worry. He said, "San Lang, don't joke around." But there was no response. In a moment of panic, Shilian actually put his head against Hua Cheng's chest in search of a heartbeat. Then he immediately realized, how could a ghost have a heartbeat? However, to his surprise, he actually heard it. Shilian was stunned. A thought quickly came to him. Logically, in his true form, Hua Cheng shouldn't be able to drown, but now he had become a 17 or 18-year-old human. So did the same rule still apply? Although he felt that Hua Cheng wasn't the kind to overlook these sorts of flaws, there was really no other explanation. No matter what, he wasn't able to wake him up. After a long internal debate, Shilian slowly reached out with his hands and placed them gently around Hua Cheng's face. The features on this face were beyond stunning. Cupping Hua Cheng's face like this and thinking about what he was about to do next made it extremely difficult for Shilian to calm his poor heart. Sitting in this tangled position, making sure that no one was around, he looked at Hua Cheng again. No signs of waking up. This was it. He prepared himself and grit his teeth. He managed to squeeze out, in barely more than a whisper, "I apologize in advance." His voice was practically shaking when he said it. He clapped his hands together to make a silent prayer before bending down with closed eyes and pressed his lips against Hua Cheng's. At the same time, Hua Cheng suddenly snapped open his eyes.